Hello, Spark fans, and welcome back to Advancing Spark, where it has been way too long since I last made a video. In fact, the last video I made was at the start of the month, talking about the news from last month. We're already at another Databricks news roundup, and many reasons for that. It's been a busy month. We've had lots of things going on. We've had SQL Bits, one of the biggest data conferences in the UK, which was D&D themed. So obviously we got really excited and made t-shirts, and the best thing in the world, we have these custom AA D20s that are going to focus. Oh, look at that. Thing of beauty. So if you ever see me walking around, I probably have a ton of those in my pocket. Just say hello. Anyway, I thought, with a whole month going on, I'm going to come and I'll do some news and I'll have a look at the release notes, and there'll be one or two minor changes released, some changes to the UI, a new button, that kind of thing. It's not like Databricks are going to release a new generative AI to rival ChatGPT, is it? Well, we have tons of things to talk about, and I've got a ton of videos I need to make over the next few weeks to catch up on all this crazy news. But today, we'll do our usual. We're going to take a look at the Databricks release notes. We'll see what's new in both the platform, and we've got a new runtime to have a look at. We'll take a look at some of the news articles, but we'll do special videos to dive into all those crazy things. If it's your first time around here, don't forget to like and subscribe. Little reminder we've been doing recently, if you are looking for Spark training, we do have the Spark fans discount on the Advancing Analytics Academy. If you go and have a look at that, I'll put a link down below. But yeah, let's go have a look at what's going on in the news. So, as always, I'm on the Azure side of the fence. I'm looking at the March 2023 release notes, and we can see what's going on. Now, we still have a day left in March. Maybe I'm early. Maybe there'll be some new releases coming in, but we'll just catch those next month. So I'm going to go right down to the bottom, and we'll start and go up from there. So, number one, Workspace files are now in public preview. You can use non-notebook files in a Databricks repo. That's the really useful thing we saw, where you could plug things in. I'm pretty sure that was already in public preview, but still, it's now enabled by default. I guess that's the main thing. So the runtime we were looking at last month, 12.2, is now GA, and that's new LTS. So got to the long-term support very quickly there. So if you're in a scenario where you're having to move from LTS, you're not doing constantly looking at runtimes, then that's great news. There is a new flavor of the Databricks LTS for you at 12.2. Lineage. So we've seen Lineage Collection in Unity Catalog for a variety of things. It can look at a notebook and realize you read from one Unity Catalog table and you push data into another Unity Cat table, and it'll give you that lineage information. We've now got jobs being included there, so you can see what job was it that triggered the notebooks that caused data to move around. So super interesting. If you're using Unity Catalog and you're using Databricks jobs, it's a really nice thing just to get an idea of, yeah, it was that notebook, but we triggered that in 3 different places. Which was the one that... It was that job. Cool. So yeah, interesting. This is one we've seen. So I spotted this a while when doing some Unity Catalog training. So let's actually gonna make a little duplicate of that. If we just dive, we can't do that. Unity Catalog's not turned on that machine. Well, I can't show you that right now. There is an Insights button you can hit in Unity Catalog to say, show me a bit about that particular table. And it'll say, well, here's some frequent queries. So if people have been hitting that table in a whole bunch of various different SQL queries, you can see actually who's been querying it and what queries they've been writing. And that's always a really useful performance thing. When I was back in the day, when I was looking after an on-prem SQL warehouse, the holy grail that we're trying to figure out is, what queries are people writing so we know how to performance tune it? Are you always going to filter on these particular columns? In which case, we'll do some Z ordering by it. We'll do some partitioning on it. We'll put a Bloom filter index on it if they're the kind of queries people are writing. So that kind of insights tracking, insight generation, super useful for looking after a solution in production. So it's cool. Very cool. There's an updated version of Data Explorer. Again, we'll see Data Explorer keep updating now that it is basically the home of Unity Catalog. But that's cool. You can go and see that. And then a little change that warms my cold dead heart is, so for a long time, DBFS, the Databricks file system, it's kind of like whenever you deploy Databricks in Azure, it creates a blob storage account just behind the scenes in the managed resource group, and that's encrypted, it's locked away, and that's where DBFS lives. And they've changed it so it's now using an Azure Data Lake Store Gen 2, which makes entire sense. So you can have some form of security. You can use all the modern stuff that ADLS Gen 2 has in there. Basically, it's a blob store that has hierarchical namespace enabled. Great. Makes entire sense. I've not dug into it, but I'm assuming it still lives in the managed resource group and it's still encrypted, so it's still not that useful. But it's still a positive change. Not going to argue. Because of that change, you've now seen some changes. If you are using things like Vena Injection, you're trying to lock down the IP addresses that can access it, then you've now got another IP address you need to look at. So if you've got things locked down, if you're using those user-defined routes, you'll need to evaluate it with that change. So keep an eye on it if you're doing lots of networky stuff around Databricks. I know we certainly are, so I need to make sure we're looking after them. Model serving. So when we did a quick demo recently, we had serverless real-time inference, and that's part of the MLflow model serving elements. That's now GA. So that was in public preview, it was all around, you could use it. It is now fully available, has SLAs around it, everyone can use it. So model serving is now fully out, which is very, very cool. A tiny UI change. We've had a consolidation of the SQL admin console and the Workspace admin console. It's always weird that you had to switch between like admin views. So if you were trying to do some setup of your SQL warehouses, you had to switch to the SQL portal, go to admin, see what it is. Just makes sense. You just pull it all together. It's now a single admin console. Great. As part of those things going GA, so Databricks model serving going GA, that's now in the Terraform Provider. So we've got a new release of the Terraform Provider. You can now do Databricks SQL alerts as part of the Terraform Provider, which is very cool. There's other bits and pieces. So if you're using Terraform, again, there's a new version of the provider. Go and have a look in there. And then, this is kind of a funny one. So if you are in a Databricks notebook, so not over on the Databricks SQL side, if you're in a Databricks notebook and you've got several cells that are running SQL, they're running Spark SQL in a notebook, and you're like, kick them off. Currently, the way notebooks work is it runs cells sequentially. So you run the first one, that'll start running. The second one will be sitting waiting in the queue until the first one's done. When it's done, it'll do the next one. Now they've enabled, if it is a SQL command you are running, you'll get a little button flash up on the ones that are queued going, I mean, we can run that now if you want us to. So interesting. So I was having to play around trying to get that to work. Now, I had to do something ridiculous. I've only got a small data set in my little test workspace. So I had to go really old school SQL, make a Itzig-Began style tally table, link that to some AdventureWorks data, so that it took long enough that I had time to kick off a parallel thing. Yeah, I had a nerdy moment trying to get this to work. So I'm going to kick off my first SQL query. I'm going to queue up my next ones. There we go. So we've now got that run now button. So while that first one's running, I can go, yeah, run that now. Just parallelize things, please. Now, I'm only on a little single node cluster. I've got 4 cores. Because even though it's running that first one, actually the later jobs have also started running. So things are just running in parallel, and as things are ready, it'll just go, right, I'm ready to go. I'm going to start using some of the slots on your Spark cluster. There we go. Things ran nicely in parallel. Pretty cool. So if you do have lots and lots and lots of SQL, if you've got a load of SQL users who've migrated a load of data warehousing logic, or they're doing just a load of analysis, and they've got lots of things they want to try and run, you've now got that button. So it's a manual trigger. You kick things off, and then you run now, please run now. And then they will all run in parallel. But it's pretty cool. Only works on an interactive cluster. Only works if someone's sat there at the notebook. It's not something you can sling off a job and it'll just treat that notebook differently. But for analysts, for people exploring data, it's actually very cool. Okay, new IP addresses in East Asia. So if you're currently, again, doing kind of that IP allow list, you can actually you need to change your custom routes to allow for the new IP addresses. A change for older Databricks runtime releases. So we saw there's various different vulnerabilities within log4j that meant it got kind of removed from later versions. They've gone back and changed previous runtime versions, so it now uses this reload 4j, I assume, to remove those vulnerabilities from older Databricks runtimes. Makes sense. You can use Jupyter notebooks in Repos. So if you're in Databricks and you're using a notebook, that is not a Jupyter notebook. It's heavily inspired by, but it is the Databricks implementation of the notebook approach. Now, You might be using other Spark providers. You might be using Jupyter elsewhere. You might have a load of data scientists who've written a load of Python in Jupyter notebooks. Now you can bring them in. You can put them inside Databricks repos, and you can do things like convert. You can do code diffs. You can see, well, is the code different, or actually is the IPYNB is the Jupyter Notebook file itself different? So you can actually sort of do, it's basically a bit more plumbed into the development lifecycle through repos, which is cool. Speaking of things that are improved in Databricks repos, I mentioned near the start, we've got that support for arbitrary files in repos actually being rolled out everywhere. Alongside that, there's also really improved the file editor. So there's a bunch of different changes that they've made to try and say, actually, if you do have just a flat Python file here, it's not that bad. It's not just Notepad. There's a few development IDE bits of functionality in there. So I've got this file. So I was in my notebooks. I've got something that turns into a proper something that turns into a full code library. So I've got my library. I've got my initiation, kind of, my setup.py. But I just want to have a look at the actual Python files and just try and edit it. So I'm inside just a flat Python file, not a notebook, not a Jupyter notebook. It's just a Python file. Now, by default, I can't really see anything about it. It's not a code editor. So before I can do anything, I need to run all my code. So I just run this, make sure it works. That's all fine. As soon as I've done that, so as soon as my code is associated to a cluster and it's kind of in my current, basically I need to start a session and I can have a look at it. But now that I'm here, I can hover over functions and I can actually sort of get the context for the objects I'm hovering over, which is kind of cool. I get automatic type down, so I can go add, oh, there we go. Yes, please, I'd like that, please. I can open that up. If I had doc strings, I can go and do doc strings on it. Essentially, I can go and actually use it a bit like a code editor. So live type down, it's useful. Oh, I can go and see what's in here. What do I want to do? Oh, no, it's going to be PySpark.SQL. Okay, and then inside SQL, it's basically making it a little bit more like an actual code editor, which is kind of cool. The other bit, the thing that always amazed people when they found it out about IDEs, if I hold down Alt, I'm on Windows, if I hold down Alt and I select several different lines, I could go import all my libraries. So just multi-cursor select is actually pretty nice. The other thing I saw they did is actually you can just do multi-cursor and actually just type in several different places at once. It doesn't have to be an arbitrary line of code. So very, very, very cool. So yeah, there's probably a few other bits. What else do we have in our list? So autocomplete, we've got variable inspection, we've got code folding. That's the other thing. I've got some functions. I can just tidy things up. So if I had a long list of functions, I can just close them all up, just work with my code a bit better. Again, these are all things that have been in code IDEs for a long time. Oh, and column boxes. So if you want to just select a big column of data rather than have to go over things. Bracket matching, just to make typing a lot better, which has been, these kind of things have been in notebooks for ages, but they didn't have it in the file editor, meaning it's really hard to actually write code in there. We never wrote code in the file editor in repos. We just used it as a quick way of syncing and then testing our code. Now they're trying to say, no, you can write code here. It has some nice things for writing code in too, which is pretty cool. So yeah, file editor, load of nice little changes, have a play around with it. It's still not the same as having a full independent IDE, but it's getting a lot better. Finally, we've got another runtime. So runtime 13 is in beta. So we can see a couple of things about what's going on in there. So what have we got? So a new change. If you're using Delta streaming and you're saying, well, ignore deletes, ignore changes in order to get it to work properly, there's a new command we can use instead. So use skip change commits. We'll do that instead. Pretty cool. So if you were using ignore changes, deprecated from 13 onwards, you need to use skip change commits. We've got the create table like function. Now, if you're using MySQL or Oracle or some other SQL providers, you'd be like, oh, okay, I know that. But T-SQL, I was like, what? And it is essentially saying, hey, I've already got a table. Can you just sort of create a table that's very, very similar using all the same settings, please? So it's not the same as cloning. I'm not cloning it down at I'm not creating the transaction log clone that we do with Delta. I'm saying actually just create a new table in my, my Hive metadata or Unity catalog, but specifically with Delta. So it's interesting, kind of resetting and restarting with no data in it. Essentially, it's, can I clone it but with no data, please? We've got the thing, so the metadata column. So the metadata column is a thing that we can add onto every row in our thing, saying this is the file it came from, this is the last modified date. It's now got some information about the file block start and end, or the file block start and length. Just interesting seeing that grow. Do be aware, if you're using that column and you have that as part of your Delta tables, that's then going to be Schema Drift. You need to make sure your tables evolve if they're using the metadata column just to expect that additional thing. Now, they put in Schema Drift for struct columns a while ago, so it shouldn't be an issue. But if you haven't got Schema Drift enabled, you might have some problems with your code if you suddenly start using Runtime 13 and you've not tested that. So other bits, some new geospatial functions. I do need to dig more into the various different H3 and Mosaic stuff to do with geospatial back from when we had Milosh on. Lots of really, really interesting stuff there. We'll dig into those eventually, do not worry. And another change, if you're using %SQL in your Python notebooks, so that's when we saw that if you have a SQL cell using that magic command and you just do a select of some data, that was always slightly annoying because you couldn't really get hold of the results. So a while ago, we saw Databricks introduce this _SQL df, and that's basically it just automatically instantiates a new data frame for you with that SQL query basically plumbed in. It types spark.sql, puts the code in, and makes that available to you. Now, we had some issues where that wasn't always reassigned. So if you're using in your code, SQL df is the results of that, and then SQL df is what is that. Sometimes it'd be referring to the wrong one. You'd have almost a race condition. So now that's basically made it a little bit more stable. It's made it so kind of you can just assume it's always going to use it. But do be aware, the parallel execution of SQL cells will not populate that SQL df. So if you're going through saying run now, don't expect SQL df to work underneath that. Honestly, if you're trying to use that, that's really good for experimentation. If you're building something that's engineered and is meant to be relying on that, don't rely on SQL df actually working. I would just always just have it in your code as data frame equals spark.sql. Here's my actual SQL. But it's up to you. You do you, obviously. Cool. Finally, there's the usual load of library upgrades. There's the bugs. There's various different things going on. I do suggest, because this is a major version change, it's a really, really quick major version change. We said version 12, 12.1, 12.2, and then suddenly we're on version 13. Always say, whenever you are moving between major Databricks runtime versions, you need to test everything. You need to test for backwards compatibility. This is a new version of Spark in 3.4.0. So you need to make sure it's actually all compliant with your code. The libraries have changed, dependencies have changed. Just test things, all right? So that's the main pile of changes I want to talk to you. We've talked about multi-SQL, talked about Lineage. We've got more things that aren't even on our list of announcements. So we had all the announcements about the VS Code extension, being able to use Databricks Connect by Spark Connect to go and write Databricks code in your local IDE. Now, videos on that are coming very soon. I'm not going to dive too much into that. Although, earlier this week, we saw this. So with the ability to run SQL codes from VS Code, we saw the release of the Databricks SQL API, allowing us to just fire SQL at the API and get a response back. So just opening it up to, rather than it having to be something that can talk to the Databricks SQL endpoint, actually anything that can call an API, you can kind of now ping SQL queries to, which is very, very cool. So being able to do that directly in VS Code, again, it's just opening up more people, making it actually accessible. So loads of interesting stuff you can go and plumb into. Now, obviously, this is going to be a big topic. If you've not heard about Dolly yet, then you're going to be hearing about Dolly quite a lot very soon, I am sure. But we've seen huge amounts of interest with generative AI models. We've seen ChatGPT just revolutionizing how people are actually building apps, how people are building knowledge-based systems, how people are doing training and support, and people, I'm pretty sure the majority of emails I'm receiving at the moment, it's just people going, ChatGPT, can you write that email for me and make it actually sound good? Because people's grammar's got a lot better recently. So we're seeing lots and lots and lots of that. Now, from the Databricks point of view, their argument is that is a really, really good model, and it's basically trained with a vast amount of data, but it's closed source. You can't go and actually get hold of it. Now, Databricks did a whole solution when they just took a really much smaller model and actually really quickly spun up basically a ChatGPT clone. It being a clone is named Dolly, like Dolly the Sheep, the famous clone sheep. So loads and loads and loads of things in there. Lots and lots of really interesting use cases about being able to spin up your own thing, being able to actually quickly try lots of different approaches. Now, we are not getting into any of that today, but just be aware, if you hear about Dolly, it's essentially Databricks' answer to ChatGPT and actually open sourcing something that is super, super, super useful and fits loads of use cases. And that isn't a big locked proprietary version of it. Now, we'll be doing a video about that soon. We'll be digging in. I'll be pulling in our resident data scientists to actually say, what does it actually mean? How does it challenge it? When should we be using that versus other things? We will do that, but not today. Do not fear. And then, yeah, other bits. There's other things in there. So private link going GA also happened earlier this month. So if you're looking actually, again, that's always the story. How can we plumb in every single bit of public access IP and get rid of them and make it fully secure? Private links, one of those things, just to help plug in that link from where you are to get to your Databricks workspace to make that entirely private. Get from Databricks talking to your data plane, make that entirely private. They are the two bits that we're talking about, that front end and back end private link. And that going GA is great news for people who are building a very locked down, secure, VNetted data platform. So we'll be looking at that. We'll be digging into what that means, and we'll be seeing what that works as well. Ooh, so just a quiet month with not really much going on, really. Yeah, just fairly chill. Yeah. So as I said, loads and loads and loads of videos to come over the next few weeks. We're talking about file arrival triggers for Databricks jobs. We'll be talking about the VS Code, the ability to write essentially Databricks code without being connected to the browser. We'll be talking about networking. We'll be talking about all of these releases. We'll be talking about Dolly. Yeah, just mountain of things that we need to talk about. And yeah, as always, try out the new runtime, test it properly, read the release notes, look into it, and check for yourselves whether or not it's the right thing to do to hop onto the latest thing. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time. Cheers.